The flash of the camera bulbs was a familiar kind of assault, a staccato burst of light that had followed him his entire life. But as Ethan Maddox stood on the marble steps of the museum, his hand resting possessively on the small of his wife's back, the glare felt different. It felt like an interrogation. He watched Sienna, his wife of 6 months, his enemy of 10 years, as she smiled for the press. It was a perfect smile, practiced and brilliant, revealing nothing of the storm that he knew raged behind her emerald eyes. A reporter shouted a question about their whirlwind romance, and Sienna's laughter was like the chime of delicate glass, beautiful and fragile. But he saw it, a flicker of something real in her gaze as she glanced at him, a raw, unguarded emotion that was gone as quickly as it appeared. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't the cold disdain he was used to. It was something far more dangerous, something that made the carefully constructed walls around his own heart tremble. He didn't know that in that single stolen glance, the entire foundation of their hostile arrangement had cracked. He didn't know that the war was over, and a new, more terrifying one was about to begin within himself. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The heir in the Maddox consolidated boardroom was worth more than the average person's annual salary. It was a carefully climate-controlled mixture of old money, imported leather, and simmering animosity. Sienna Brooks felt the weight of it pressing down on her, a physical manifestation of a rivalry that had poisoned her family and the Maddoxes for 3 generations. She sat opposite Ethan Maddox, the living embodiment of that rivalry. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line, his custom-tailored suit unable to conceal the rigid set of his shoulders. He hadn't looked at her once since they were summoned, preferring to stare at the polished mahogany of the table as if it held the secrets of the universe. Sienna wished it did. She wished it would swallow her whole. The fighting ends now. The voice of Alistair Maddox, Ethan's father, boomed across the table, shaking Sienna from her morbid thoughts. He was a man carved from granite and ambition, with eyes that assessed everything for its value. Beside him, Sienna's own father, Richard Brooks, nodded in grim agreement. Richard was quieter, his power more insidious, but no less absolute. They were kings of industry, titans of the luxury hotel world, and they had been at war for 50 years. The constant undercutting, the poaching of staff, the public smear campaigns, it has become a liability, Richard said, his voice smooth but laced with steel. Our shareholders are restless. The market is changing. A divided front is a weak one. Sienna's stomach clenched. She knew this wasn't about peace. It was about profit. It was always about profit. Alistair leaned forward, his gaze finally pinning both his son and Sienna to their chairs. We have spent months negotiating a merger, a joining of Maddox Consolidated and Brooks International. It will create the largest luxury hospitality empire in the world. He paused, letting the magnitude of his words settle. But a deal of this scale requires more than signatures on paper. It requires a symbol, a gesture of absolute, unbreakable unity. Sienna felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. She risked a glance at Ethan. For the first time, his cool facade had cracked. A muscle jumped in his jaw, and his knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of his chair. He knew what was coming. They both did. "You will be married," Richard Brooks stated, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep, dark well. "In 1 month." The silence that followed was more violent than any shout. Sienna's breath hitched. It was one thing to be a pawn in their corporate games, another to be a sacrifice. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared her throat, forcing strength into her tone. "Absolutely not. There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Alistair said, his tone final. "This isn't a request, Sienna. Or for you, Ethan. This is the cost of securing your legacies. It is the foundation upon which we will build a dynasty. You can't be serious, Ethan finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping harshly against the floor. You want to chain me to her? The daughter of the man who has tried to ruin us at every turn? His glare was a physical blow, filled with a decade of accumulated resentment. Sienna flinched but met his gaze, her own anger flaring to life. As if I'm thrilled at the prospect of being shackled to you, you arrogant, entitled brute. You've made my life a living hell since we were 16. Their animosity was legendary, a bitter echo of their family's war. It had started in the hallowed halls of a private high school where they were pitted against each other in everything from debate club to student council elections. He saw her as a spoiled, conniving princess. She saw him as a ruthless, arrogant jock who got everything he wanted. They were two sides of the same gilded coin, and they had spent their lives trying to tarnish the other. Enough! Richard's voice cut through their argument. This is not a debate. The contracts are drawn. The announcements will be made tomorrow. You will present a united front. You will smile for the cameras. You will attend the parties. And you will live under the same roof. The success of a multi-billion-dollar merger rests on your ability to pretend you don't despise one another. Do you understand? It wasn't a question. It was an order. Sienna looked from her father's implacable face to Alistair's cold determination. There was no escape. She was trapped in a cage not of her own making, and locked inside with her was the one person in the world she loathed more than anything. She looked at Ethan, and in his stormy gray eyes, she saw her own despair reflected back at her. They were enemies, yes, but in that moment, they were also fellow prisoners. The wedding was a spectacle of obscene wealth and hollow smiles. It was held at the newly merged company's flagship hotel, a monument to the very truce it was meant to celebrate. Sienna walked down an aisle carpeted in thousands of white roses, her couture gown feeling like a shroud. Every camera flash felt like a gunshot, every polite applause like a death knell. When she reached the altar, Ethan took her hand. His touch was icy cold, his fingers gripping hers with a bruising force that was meant for her alone. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a venomous whisper shielded by a counterfeit smile. Try not to look like you're walking to your execution, Brooks. It's bad for the brand. It's Maddox now, she hissed back, her nails digging into his palm. And don't worry, I'm an excellent actress. I've been pretending you're a decent human being for the last hour. Their vows were a masterpiece of hypocrisy, promises of love and honor that tasted like ash in their mouths. When he lifted her veil, his eyes were chips of slate. The kiss was brief, chaste, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a transaction, sealed for an audience of investors and society columnists. Their new home was a penthouse apartment that overlooked the entire city, a glass palace with panoramic views and an atmosphere as cold as a tomb. The interior was a study in minimalist luxury stark white walls, gleaming chrome, and furniture that looked more like art than something to be sat on. It was beautiful, impersonal, and utterly sterile, a perfect reflection of their marriage. The first night was a silent war. They moved through the cavernous space like ghosts, each claiming territory. He took the master suite on the east wing, she took the one on the west. They didn't speak a word. The only sounds were the soft click of her heels on the marble floor and the heavy thud of his briefcase on a table. The next morning, Sienna found a document lying on the kitchen island, a pristine white marble expanse that could seat 12. It was typed, single-spaced, and titled, The Agreement. She scanned the clauses, her blood beginning to boil. It was a list of rules, as cold and clinical as a business contract. Public appearances are mandatory and require a convincing display of affection. Subclause 1A. Affection is defined as hand-holding, appropriate smiles, and light, not-intrusive physical contact. Separate bedrooms and private lives are to be maintained at all times. No unannounced entry into the other's designated wing. No bringing personal guests to the apartment without 24-hour prior written consent from the other party. All household and financial matters will be handled by staff. A joint account will be maintained for public-facing expenses. This agreement is binding for a minimum of 2 years, or until the merger is fully stabilized, whichever is longer. Dissolution of the marriage before the agreed-upon term will result in severe financial penalties for both families. At the bottom, in his sharp, arrogant script, was his signature. A line was waiting for hers. When he walked into the kitchen, nodding a silk tie, she was holding the paper as if it were contaminated. "What the hell is this, Ethan?" He didn't look at her, moving to the built-in espresso machine. "It's clarity. It's a framework for our cohabitation. I thought you, of all people, would appreciate a clear set of rules. I appreciate not being treated like a hostile corporate takeover," she shot back. "You think you can just dictate the terms of my life with a memo?" He finally turned, leaning back against the counter, a steaming cup in his hand. His eyes were hooded, unreadable. "Our life? Sienna. And yes, I do. Because if we're going to survive this farce, we need boundaries. This isn't a real marriage. Let's not pretend it is. This document protects us both. It keeps your life out of mine and my life out of yours. Isn't that what you want?" She hated that he was right. She hated the cold, logical sense it made. This wasn't a life, it was a performance. And every performance needed a script. With a shaking hand, she picked up the pen he'd left on the counter and signed her name. The ink was a stark, black slash. A final surrender. "Fine," she said, sliding the paper back across the marble. "But don't think for a second this makes us partners. It just makes us well-organized enemies." He took a slow sip of his espresso, his eyes never leaving hers. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Brooks." He paused, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. "I mean, Maddox." The first few months were a masterclass in cold civility. They were impeccable performers in public, the golden couple of the business world. At charity galas, he would rest his hand on her waist, the warmth of his palm a shocking contrast to the icy distance in his eyes. At press conferences, she would gaze at him with manufactured adoration, her mind cataloging all the ways she could cheerfully strangle him with his own expensive tie. They were a lie, but they were a beautiful one. Behind the closed doors of their penthouse, the truce was fragile. They communicated through clipped sentences and notes left with the housekeeper. They divided the space, the city, and their lives with surgical precision. He had his gym, his study, his friends. She had her art studio, her charities, her own circle. They were two planets in the same solar system, held in a miserable orbit by the gravitational pull of their family's ambition. The first crack in the facade appeared at a fundraiser for the city opera. Sienna was cornered by Bartholomew Vance, a smarmy competitor whose company had lost a major resort bid to the newly formed Maddox Brooks empire. "Sienna, darling," Vance oozed, his eyes roaming over her emerald green dress with an oily possessiveness. "You look radiant. Marriage certainly agrees with you. Or perhaps it's the thrill of victory?" "Bartholomew," Sienna said, her smile tight. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "That little tip-off about the structural survey on the Hawaiian property, very clever. Your father must be so proud you're still a Brooks girl at heart, even with a new name." Sienna's blood ran cold. He was implying she had leaked information to sabotage a rival, a tactic straight out of her father's old playbook. It was a lie, but a damaging one. "You're mistaken." "Am I?" Vance's smile widened. "Tell me, does your new husband know how you play the game?" Before she could form a scathing reply, a low voice cut through the air. "He knows his wife is a woman of integrity, something you wouldn't recognize, Vance." Ethan was there, appearing as if from nowhere. He moved to her side, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. It was part of the act, she knew, but the heat of his body against hers felt different this time. It felt like a shield. "Maddox?" Vance sneered, taking a step back. "Just congratulating your lovely bride on her business acumen." "I heard what you were implying." Ethan's voice was dangerously soft, but it carried the chilling weight of his power. "And I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. An attack on my wife is an attack on my company, and I assure you, you don't want a war with me." There was no mistaking the threat. Vance's bravado evaporated, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He mumbled a hasty apology and scurried away, melting back into the crowd. The moment he was gone, Sienna expected Ethan to drop the act, to step away and fix her with his usual cold glare. But he didn't. His arm remained around her, his thumb stroking her side in a slow, almost unconscious rhythm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing its hard edge. She was stunned into silence for a moment. He had defended her, not for the cameras, not for their fathers, but for her. "You." "Yes. Thank you." "He's a snake," Ethan said, his eyes scanning the crowd, a flicker of something dark and protective in their depths. "Don't let him get to you." "I wasn't going to," she said, finding her voice, "but I appreciate the intervention." He finally looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than hostility in his expression. It was a complex mixture of concern, annoyance, and something else she couldn't quite name. "We're a team in public, Sienna. That's the deal. No one gets to undermine that." It was a business explanation, a logical reason for his actions. But it didn't explain the lingering warmth of his hand, or the way his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. She told herself it was nothing, just a calculated move to protect their joint interests. But as he led her back towards the party, his hand still firmly on her waist, a tiny, treacherous part of her heart wondered if it might be something more. That night, something shifted. The air in the penthouse still held its chill, but it was no longer glacial. When their paths crossed in the long hallway connecting their wings, instead of ignoring each other, there was a brief, almost awkward nod. A silent acknowledgement of the battle they had won together. A few weeks later, Sienna was in her studio, a large, light-filled room she had converted from 2 spare bedrooms. It was her sanctuary, the one place in the sterile apartment that felt like hers. She was working on a large, abstract canvas, a chaotic swirl of blues and grays that mirrored the turmoil in her own mind. She was so lost in the painting that she didn't hear him approach. "I didn't know you painted." She jumped, spinning around to find Ethan leaning against the doorframe, a curious expression on his face. He was dressed down in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, the casual attire making him look younger, less like a corporate titan, and more like the boy she had once known. "It's a hobby," she said, feeling strangely exposed. No one ever came into her studio. It was an unspoken rule. He walked further into the room, his eyes scanning the canvases that lined the walls. Most were unfinished, fragments of emotions she couldn't quite articulate. "You're good," he said, his voice quiet with surprise. He stopped in front of the canvas she was working on. "This one is intense." "It's a mess," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "No," he said, his gaze fixed on the painting. "It's not a mess. It's a storm." He looked at her then, and his eyes held a startling understanding. "I know the feeling." The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their animosity. He was under pressure, too. She saw it sometimes in the faint shadows under his eyes, in the way he would stare out at the city skyline late at night from his balcony. He was carrying the weight of an empire, just as she was. "My father wants to fast-track the Asian expansion," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to be confiding in her. "He wants to break ground in 3 new markets by the end of the year. It's too aggressive. It's reckless." "My father is pushing for the same thing," Sienna admitted, surprised by her own willingness to share. "He sees it as a show of dominance." "They see everything as a battle," Ethan said, a note of weariness in his voice she had never heard before. "They don't care about sustainable growth. They just want to win." They stood in silence for a moment, the smell of turpentine and oil paint filling the space between them. For the first time, they weren't enemies. They weren't even allies in a corporate scheme. They were just 2 people, trapped in the same gilded cage, beginning to realize they were facing the same demons. "Sienna," he said, his voice soft. He took a step closer. "About the other night with Vance. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." "You handled it," she said, her heart beating a little faster. Still, he had no right. His gaze dropped to her hands, which were stained with cobalt blue paint. Without thinking, he reached out and gently took one, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. His touch was warm, tentative, a stark contrast to the cold, contractual way he had held her hand at their wedding. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned, the moment broken. I have to finish this." He looked flustered, as if surprised by his own actions. "Right. Of course. I'll leave you to it." He retreated to the doorway, pausing for a moment. "For what it's worth, I think the storm is beautiful." He was gone before she could reply. Sienna stood frozen, her hand tingling where he had touched it. She looked at her painting, at the chaotic swirl of colors, and for the first time, she saw a tiny speck of gold in the heart of the storm, a flicker of light she hadn't realized she'd painted. It was a slow, insidious change, a falling. It wasn't in grand gestures, but in the small, almost imperceptible shifts in their daily lives. It was in the way he started leaving a second cup of coffee on the counter in the mornings, knowing she liked the same dark roast he did. It was in the way she found herself leaving a plate of leftovers for him when she knew he'd be working late. It was in the shared, exasperated glances during tense board meetings with their fathers. He started seeking her out in the evenings, not in her studio, but in the large, impersonal living room. He would sit at one end of the massive sofa, she at the other, a silent agreement to share the space. Sometimes they would talk, stilted conversations about the market, about a new hotel design, about anything other than themselves. But slowly, the topics grew more personal. She learned he had wanted to be an architect before his father steered him into the family business. He learned she had a passion for restoring old books, a quiet hobby no one knew about. He was the one who fell first. Sienna wasn't sure when it happened, but she began to see it in the little things. It was in the way his eyes would follow her when she walked into a room, a quiet intensity that had replaced the old hostility. It was in the way he would find excuses to be near her, his hand brushing hers as they reached for the same file, the contact lingering a moment too long. One evening, they were returning from another mandatory charity dinner. Sienna's feet were aching from her heels, and a headache was pounding behind her eyes. As they stepped into the private elevator that went straight to their penthouse, she leaned her head back against the cool metal wall and closed her eyes. "Long night?" Ethan's voice was gentle. "The longest," she murmured. The elevator glided to a smooth stop, and the doors opened to their apartment. She started to walk out, but stumbled, her ankle twisting. Before she could fall, strong arms were around her, steadying her. "Easy, Finn," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. He didn't let go. Instead, he scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she gasped, her hands flying to his shoulders. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Your feet are killing you," he said, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "And for once, there are no cameras around to see this." He carried her through the silent apartment, his stride confident and sure. He didn't take her to her wing. He carried her to his. His suite was a mirror of hers in layout, but it was different in feel. It was masculine, filled with dark woods, leather-bound books, and the faint, clean scent of his cologne. It felt like him. He gently set her down on a plush armchair and knelt in front of her, his hands going to the straps of her heels. "I can do that," she protested, her voice breathy. "Let me," he said simply. His fingers were surprisingly gentle as he unbuckled the shoes and slipped them from her feet. He then began to massage her aching arches, his thumbs working in slow, deliberate circles. The sensation was exquisite, a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful. But it was more than just physical. It was the intimacy of the act, the quiet servitude, the look of intense concentration on his face. He was looking at her feet, but she felt as if he were seeing right into her soul. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she whispered, the question she had been afraid to ask for weeks. He looked up, his gray eyes dark and serious. "Maybe I'm tired of fighting," he said, his voice low. "Maybe I'm starting to see the woman my family taught me to hate, and I'm realizing they were wrong." He held her gaze, and in that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled. The animosity, the resentment, the years of carefully nurtured hatred, it all melted away under the warmth of his stare. This was not the arrogant boy from high school, or the ruthless businessman from the boardroom. This was just Ethan, and he was looking at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. Her hand came up to cup his cheek, her thumb tracing the hard line of his jaw. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, with months of repressed tension and a dawning, terrifying emotion that felt a lot like hope. He was falling. And the most terrifying part? She realized she was falling right along with him. The fragile peace they had built was shattered by a single headline. Sienna saw it on a tablet left on the breakfast bar, the bold black letters screaming from the screen of a notorious financial gossip site. "Brooks's daughter plays dirty. Did Maddox Brooks sabotage their own bid to settle an old score?" Her blood turned to ice. The article was a venomous piece of fiction, twisting a recent, failed acquisition in South America into a narrative of corporate espionage. It claimed that confidential details of their bid were leaked to a competitor, and it heavily implied that the source of the leak was Sienna herself. The proof was a grainy photo of her having coffee with a junior executive from the rival company and innocent meeting she'd taken as a favor to a friend. But the most damning part was the mention of an old high school incident, a vicious rumor Ethan had started that she'd cheated to win the student council presidency. The article spun it as a pattern of behavior, painting her as a treacherous snake in the Maddox nest. She heard his footsteps and looked up to see Ethan standing in the archway, his face a mask of thunder. He was holding his own phone, the same headline no doubt burning on his screen. "Sienna," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "What is this?" "It's a lie, Ethan," she said, standing up, her hands trembling. "You know it is. I had coffee with him, that's all. It was a setup. A setup that uses a story only you and I would know the details of," he countered, his eyes hard as flint. The warmth from the night before, the tentative trust they had built, was gone, replaced by the old, familiar suspicion. How would they know about the student council rumor? "I don't know," she cried, frustration and hurt warring within her. "Maybe you told someone," Maybe your father did. My family might play dirty, but I don't. Don't you? He shot back, taking a step closer. The hurt in his eyes was what wounded her the most. He wasn't just angry, he was betrayed. My father and yours are at each other's throats over this. The board is in an uproar, and it all points back to you. So that's it? She asked, her voice breaking. After everything, you just instantly believe I'm capable of this? That I would betray you? He didn't answer. He just looked at her, his face a battleground of doubt and old prejudices. And in his silence, she found her answer. He didn't trust her. Not really. The foundation they had built was made of sand, and the first wave had washed it all away. I see, she said, a cold calm settling over her. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold her shattering heart together. So much for being a team. She turned and walked away, not to her wing, but to the front door. She needed to breathe, to escape the suffocating weight of his distrust. As the elevator doors closed, she saw him standing there, his face etched with a pain that mirrored her own. But it was too late. The damage was done. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The company's stock dipped. The board called an emergency meeting. Alistair and Richard were at war again, their brief truce forgotten, each accusing the other's family of treachery. The penthouse became a cold, silent prison once more. Ethan moved back into his wing, and the invisible wall between them was now fortified with steel and suspicion. Sienna, however, refused to be a victim. The hurt was a sharp, physical ache in her chest, but beneath it, her anger was hardening into resolve. Someone had set her up, and they had used her history with Ethan to do it. They had weaponized their past against their future. She wouldn't let them win. She started digging. She used her own contacts, the ones her father didn't know about. She spent hours in her study, not painting, but cross-referencing visitor logs, phone records, and financial reports. She was a Brooks after all. She knew how to find the rot beneath the polished surface. 2 days later, she found it. A series of encrypted payments from a Maddox Brooks subsidiary account to an offshore entity owned by none other than Bartholomew Vance. The payments were authorized by a senior vice president in the company, a man named Marcus Thornethan's uncle. Marcus had always been resentful of Alistair's power and had been vocal in his opposition to the merger, believing it diluted the Maddox legacy. He had used Sienna as the perfect scapegoat, knowing Ethan's history with her would make the betrayal believable. He had leaked the story, planting the seed of doubt that he knew would grow like a weed in the fertile ground of their family's feud. Sienna printed everything, her hands steady. She didn't go to her father or to Alistair. She went straight to Ethan. She found him in his study, staring at a wall of monitors displaying stock tickers, all of them bleeding red. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. She placed the file on his desk without a word. He looked from the file to her face, his expression wary. "What is this?" "The truth," she said, her voice even. "It's everything you need to know about who really betrayed you. It wasn't me, Ethan. It was your own blood." He opened the file. She watched as he read, his eyes flying across the pages. She saw the moment he understood. The rigid set of his jaw slackened, the suspicion in his eyes replaced by a dawning horror, and then a wave of profound, gut-wrenching shame. He looked up at her, his face pale. "Sienna Ives, you believed him," she said, her voice quiet but unforgiving. "You believed it was me. After all these months, after everything, your first instinct was to believe I was the enemy. I was a fool," he said, his voice raw. He stood up, rounding the desk to stand in front of her. "I was a blind, arrogant fool. I let our past, our families, all of it, I let it poison the one good thing in my life." He reached for her, his hands hovering in the air between them. "I am so sorry," Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed now burned in her eyes. "Sorry doesn't fix it, Ethan. You didn't trust me." "And without trust, what are we? We're just back to the contract. A business arrangement." "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He finally let his hands rest on her arms, his grip gentle but firm, as if he were afraid she would vanish. "It was never just a contract for me, Sienna. Not for a long time. I was just too proud and too scared to admit it." He looked at her, his soul bared in his eyes. "I love you. I know it's the worst possible time to say it, and I know I have no right, but it's the truth. I love your fire and your strength, and the way you see the world. I love the woman who paints storms, not the heiress my father wanted me to marry." Her breath caught in her throat. The words she had secretly, desperately longed to hear were finally being said, in the midst of the wreckage of their trust. "Don't say that just because you feel guilty," she whispered. "I'm saying it because it's the truest thing I know," he insisted. "And I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you, if you'll let me. Let me fix this. Let us fix this. Together." She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception, any flicker of doubt. She found only a deep, aching sincerity and a desperate plea for forgiveness. He had fallen first, yes, but he had also been the first to break them. And now, he was the one offering to rebuild. The emergency board meeting was a lion's den. Alistair and Richard sat at opposite ends of the table, their faces grim. Marcus Thorne sat near his brother, looking smug and concerned in equal measure. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, the tension thick enough to taste. The door opened, and Ethan walked in. But he wasn't alone. Sienna was at his side, her hand held firmly in his. They presented a united front, not of manufactured perfection, but of quiet, unshakable strength. "Before this meeting goes any further," Ethan began, his voice ringing with authority, "my wife and I have something to present." What followed was a calm, systematic execution. Ethan laid out the evidence, piece by piece, while Sienna provided the context, her knowledge of the industry's underbelly proving invaluable. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't make accusations. They simply presented the facts. The offshore accounts, the doctored emails, the timeline that proved Marcus Thorne had orchestrated the entire sabotage. When they were finished, the room was silent. Marcus's face had turned a pasty white. Alistair looked at his brother with a dawning, horrified disbelief. Richard Brooks looked at his daughter, and for the first time in her life, Sienna saw a flicker of genuine, unadulterated pride in his eyes. Ethan and Sienna had done what their fathers never could. They had ended the war not by force, but by truth. They had exposed the real enemy, the one who fed on chaos and distrust, and in doing so, had solidified their own alliance. Later that night, the penthouse was quiet. The storm had passed. They stood on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below them like a carpet of fallen stars. "He's been removed from the board," Ethan said softly. "My father, he's handling it." "I'm sorry it was your family," Sienna said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "He threatened our family," Ethan corrected her, his arm tightening around her. "You and me. That's my family now." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city breathe. The cold, sterile apartment behind them no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a home they had fought for. Sienna turned to face him, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "You said you loved me." "I do," he said, his voice unwavering. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good," she whispered, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "Because despite my better judgment and years of evidence to the contrary, I love you too, Ethan Maddox." His answering smile was like the sunrise after a long night. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like their first kiss at the altar. This one was deep and hungry, filled with apology and promise, with the raw, desperate relief of two enemies who had finally found their way home. It was a kiss that sealed not a merger of companies, but a merger of souls. Their beginning was a lie, a contract forced upon them by feuding kings. But in the end, in the ruins of a war, they were never meant to survive. They had built their own kingdom, founded not on power or wealth, but on a trust that had been shattered and rebuilt, stronger and more precious than any inheritance.